Hello, AP Psychology students, and welcome back. Today we are continuing our discussion of personality theories, but we are moving away from the psychoanalytic theory into the humanistic theory of personality. So this is still topic 4.4 of the AP curriculum, and it meets learning objective 4.4b, which is explain how humanistic theory of personality defines and assesses personality. So we're going to get at this objective with two essential questions. The first is, what do humanistic theories believe influence or drive our personality? And second is, how can we assess the personality from this perspective? So when learning about humanistic personality theory, it's important to take a step before we discuss what it is, to talk about where it came from, or like what made psychologists create this theory. So it was created as a response to both the psychoanalytic and the behavioral theories. So if we look at kind of like the history of psychology, psychoanalytic theory or psychoanalytic perspective was kind of what we call the first force. So it was the idea, like we talked about in the previous videos, behavior was determined by the unconscious, really a lack of free will, and very much kind of driven by aggressive, kind of like negative parts of humanity. So the second force, and created as a result, or like in opposition almost to psychoanalytic perspective, was the behavioral or the behaviorism perspective. And we talked about this a little bit when we did the learning unit. So, operant and classical conditioning, and just the idea that your behavior is determined by your environment, right? Again, really lack of free will, not really focusing on, the positives necessarily, but just the idea that your environment and the way it punishes or reinforces can stimulate different behavior. So humanistic theory is a reaction to both of those. So it wanted to emphasize humanity's full potential, and kind of the goodness in humanity, right? And also this idea that humans do have free will, that you do get to choose your path when it comes to certain things that happen in your lifetime. So their focus really is this idea that self-actualization, which is your drive to be your full potential, to meet your full potential, the best version of yourself, is what drives your personality. So let's spend a little more time talking about that self-actualizing idea, right? So humanistic psychologists believe that your personality, similar to psychoanalytic psychologists that believed your personality was driven by the unconscious, they believe that you are driven by this concept called the self-actualizing tendency. And this is your desire to reach your full potential and develop into the best version of yourself, right? And that this is at your core what humans are driven to do. However, you still need some things in the environment to make this a reality for humanity. So the requirements that they believed were necessary in your immediate environment were unconditional positive regard, which is at its simplest definition, acceptance. If you look over at this quote over here from Carl Rogers, he's one of the founders of humanistic personality theory or humanistic theory in general. It talks about that it's an attitude of grace. It's an attitude of knowing who we are as people, our failings, our worst, knowing us at our worst and our best, and believing that we are still accepted, right? So this is the idea of unconditional positive regard. And then we need genuineness. So we need open, honest communication, relationships with people in our lives. And we need empathy. So we need to receive empathy, which is where people share and mirror our feelings, and we need to give empathy. And when these conditions are met, then you have the best environment for someone to reach their full potential, develop into the best version of themselves, etc. So with all this, self-actualizing tendency, the idea is that when you're in the environment and you're being given these various, genuineness, acceptance, all these things, or not, you are forming a self-concept, right? And a self-concept is just all the ideas, thoughts, and feelings that we have about ourselves, right? It answers the question, who am I? And your who am I is constantly being developed as you grow, based on how people around you are treating you, the reaction you're getting from your environment, your beliefs about yourself, how you feel about yourself, right? And this can either end up giving you a positive self-concept, which is where you have this who you are is very close to who you want to be, right? Like there's a lot of overlap. It doesn't mean it's exactly, of course, you're always kind of like wanting to be a better version, but there's a lot of overlap between who you are and who you think you should be, or who, the best version of yourself. And this leads to people being happy and optimistic. There's also a negative self-concept. So if you are always getting the opposite of unconditional positive regard, so conditional positive regard, where people are like, I will only accept you if you do this, or they're not genuine with you, or you don't have empathy, right? This can make you have a negative self-concept where your real self and your ideal self are very far apart, right? And this leads to being dissatisfied and pessimistic about the world around you. And if you see in this graphic here, you see that ideally you want to be congruent, right? So you want to have a real self and an ideal self, or a perceived self and an ideal self overlapping, and that leads to, you know, the happiest version of yourself, versus having incongruence, which leads to a more negative self-concept because you're always wishing you were something else, and there's not a lot of overlap between who you think you are and who you want to be. So when we talk about assessing the self-concept, in terms of, you know, we talk about assessing the unconscious with psychoanalytic. So how do we assess the self-concept? How do we assess if you're positive or negative, or how do we assess if you have self-actualizing tendency, that kind of thing, or what it is, or, you know, what your full potential is? So questionnaires are used. There's one we're going to do in class called the Q-sort, where you kind of like look at your ideal versus your real self. However, most of the time, a lot of this work on self-concept and understanding your self-concept and who you are comes from interviews and therapeutic conversations. So, you know, really discovering who the person is through having a conversation with them and through being in a room with them and giving them that unconditional positive regard, genuineness, empathy, in order for them to share their true story and for you to learn about all, you know, the various parts of their life and their story. So today we talked about the humanistic theory of personality, and we focused on, you know, what drives it, that self-actualizing tendency, the self-concept, and how you assess all of those ideas. So make sure you can answer these essential questions before you stop the video. That's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.